She quietly boarded her first-class flight, dressed in simple clothes, excited for her journey. But before the plane even left the ground, a flight attendant humiliated her, forcing her to give up her seat for a wealthier-looking passenger. Everyone thought she was just an ordinary teenager who didn't belong. What they didn't realize was that she wasn't just a passenger. She was the hidden owner of the entire airline, and by the time the flight landed, the ones who judged her were about to face a reality they never saw coming. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. The sun hung low over the airport, washing everything in a soft golden light. Tessa clutched her boarding pass tightly as she made her way toward the gate, her heart thudding with a mix of excitement and nerves. It was her first trip alone, a reward from her father for graduating at the top of her class. He had surprised her with a first-class ticket, telling her she deserved to see the world in comfort. Dressed in a plain gray hoodie and worn sneakers, Tessa didn't think she stood out among the other travelers, and honestly, she preferred it that way. Blending in was safer, easier. She walked onto the plane with a polite nod to the attendants at the door and found her seat. 2D by the window. The seat was wide and soft, with a thick blanket folded neatly on top. Tessa smiled to herself, sliding her backpack under the seat in front of her and pulling out a well-worn novel. Around her, sharply dressed men and women settled into their own seats, speaking softly or tapping on their phones. A few glanced at her, some with curiosity, others with indifference. Tessa kept her head down, not wanting to draw attention. The cabin door closed, and a few minutes later, a flight attendant named Paula began making her way through first class, checking seatbelts and offering small smiles. She had a sharp look about her, from her perfectly pinned hair to the precise crease in her skirt. Paula greeted an older man in a business suit with a warm laugh and offered a blanket to a woman wearing pearls. But when she reached Tessa, her smile wavered. Paula stopped beside her row, adjusting the sleeve of her jacket before speaking. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her voice pleasant but clipped. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Tessa looked up, startled, and nodded quickly. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her ticket. "Yes, it's 2D, she said. Paula took the ticket and scanned it with a tight-lipped smile, her eyes flicking from the paper to Tessa and back again. Before she could say anything more, another woman appeared at Paula's side. She was tall, wearing a crisp white blazer, and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than Tessa's entire college wardrobe. Her name tag read, Victoria. She spoke in a low voice to Paula, but Tessa could still hear every word. "Is there a problem? I was told this seat was being prepared for me." Paula nodded at Victoria, then turned back to Tessa, her voice now louder, meant for others nearby to hear. "It seems there's been a seating error. We'll need you to relocate so this guest can be accommodated." Tessa stared at her, confusion flickering across her face. "But this is my seat," she said quietly. "I have the ticket." Victoria shifted impatiently beside them, tapping her manicured nails against the handle of her bag. Paula's smile tightened further. "I understand, but this seat was specifically arranged for our frequent flyer member," she said, gesturing at Victoria. "We'll find you a seat further back. Thank you for understanding." Heads had started to turn now. Tessa felt the stares settle on her like a heavy weight. Her chest tightened. She wanted to protest, to stand her ground, but the heat of embarrassment burned through her resolve. She grabbed her backpack with shaky hands, slipping her book inside without looking at anyone. Victoria slid into the seat as soon as Tessa stood up, not offering a word or a glance. Paula gave a nod, as if closing a deal, and guided Tessa toward the back of the plane. She found herself squeezed into a middle seat near the bathrooms, the scent of cleaning supplies and stale air heavy around her. She sat down stiffly, staring at the tray table in front of her, blinking back the sting of tears. Pulling her phone from her bag, she typed a short message to her father. "They moved me to the back. Said someone else needed my seat. I didn't argue." She pressed send and tucked the phone away, resting her forehead against the cool window. The engines rumbled to life beneath her, but her mind was racing too fast to notice. In the first-class cabin, Victoria sipped her champagne, while Paula moved down the aisle offering drinks and forced smiles, already forgetting about the girl she had pushed aside. Neither of them noticed the captain speaking quietly into his headset. Neither of them knew that Tessa's father wasn't just any father. He was the founder and owner of the very airline they were flying on. Tessa sat frozen in her cramped economy seat as the plane lifted off the ground. She barely noticed the feeling of weightlessness during takeoff. Her mind kept replaying what had just happened. She had done nothing wrong. She had been polite. She had her ticket. Yet she had been pushed aside as if she didn't belong. She stared blankly at the seat back in front of her, feeling a lump form in her throat that she refused to let out. She wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She looked down and saw a reply from her father. His message was short but firm. "Stay calm. Don't worry. I'm handling it." Tessa swallowed hard, her heart thudding louder. Her father was usually calm about most things, but she knew when he said he was handling something. It meant people were about to find out who they had messed with. Up in first class, Paula finished her final checks and returned to the galley with a smug smile. Victoria reclined her seat and pulled a silk eye mask over her eyes, settling in for what she clearly expected to be a peaceful flight. Paula poured herself a quick cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, chatting softly with another attendant named Brooke. "Some people just don't understand," Paula said with a small laugh. "First class isn't for everyone. You can tell when someone doesn't belong." Brooke didn't say much. She had noticed how uncomfortable the girl had looked. She had seen the ticket too, and she knew the seat assignment was correct. But Brooke also knew Paula well enough to stay silent. Paula had a way of making trouble for anyone who crossed her. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Captain Reynolds adjusted his headset as he received a call through the private line from ground control. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he listened. He didn't interrupt, just nodded slowly and responded with a simple, "Understood. I'll take care of it." Setting the headset down, he turned to his co-pilot Mason, who raised an eyebrow in question. "What's up?" Mason asked. Captain Reynolds gave a small, tight smile. "Seems like we've got a bit of a situation in first class. Passenger relocation. Turns out the young lady moved to the back owns a little more than just a seat on this plane." Mason blinked. "You're kidding." Captain Reynolds shook his head. "Her father is Jacob Brennan, founder and majority owner of this airline, and he's watching everything unfold from the executive tower right now." Mason let out a low whistle. "Paula's about to have a very bad day." The captain gave a short nod, picking up the intercom. His voice was calm, professional, but carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "Flight crew, please note. We have been advised of a critical seating concern that needs immediate correction. Lead flight attendant to report to the cockpit as soon as possible." Down in the galley, Paula straightened, puzzled. She glanced at Brooke, who just gave a small shrug. Without hurrying, Paula set down her coffee cup and made her way toward the front, completely unaware that her world was about to tilt sharply out of her control. Paula smoothed down her uniform as she approached the cockpit door, fixing a smile on her face. She knocked lightly and waited. A moment later, the door opened, and Captain Reynolds motioned her inside. She stepped in confidently, expecting maybe a small reminder about customer service or an issue with a passenger complaint. She was not expecting the cold, serious looks she received from both pilots. "Have a seat, Paula," Captain Reynolds said, his voice polite but flat. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before lowering herself into the jump seat behind them. The door shut with a soft click, closing them into a world of low beeps and steady engine hums. Captain Reynolds turned in his seat slightly to face her. "We've been contacted by corporate headquarters regarding a situation that occurred during boarding," he said evenly. Paula blinked, confusion tightening in her chest. "A situation?" she repeated. "The young woman you removed from seat 2D," he continued, his voice low but sharp, "was fully authorized to sit there. She had a first-class ticket. There was no mistake." Paula opened her mouth, searching for words, but the captain raised a hand. It gets worse. Her name is Tessa Brennan. Her father is Jacob Brennan. The name hit her like a slap. Paula sat up straighter, her mouth going dry. She had heard the name before, of course. Everyone in the airline industry knew it. Jacob Brennan wasn't just the founder. He was the face, the money, and the power behind everything. Mr. Brennan personally called ground operations, Captain Reynolds said, his voice cutting through the heavy air. He was very clear. Immediate action must be taken. You are to return the passenger to her original seat. You will apologize publicly. And when we land, you will be meeting with company executives for a formal review. Paula felt the blood drain from her face. She had dealt with angry customers before. She had smoothed over complaints, charmed difficult passengers. But this was different. This wasn't about a missed drink order or a lost bag. This was about humiliating the owner's daughter in front of a plane full of people. I didn't know, Paula stammered, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. You didn't bother to check, Captain Reynolds corrected her. He didn't raise his voice, but the disappointment in his tone was worse than yelling. You judged her by how she looked, and now you're going to fix it. He picked up the intercom and pressed a button. Attention crew, lead flight attendant Paula, please return to cabin 2 immediately. Paula stood up on shaky legs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She left the cockpit without another word, her mind swirling with fear and regret. As she made her way back through the first-class cabin, she felt the curious eyes of the passengers following her. They had no idea what was happening yet, but they would. They would very soon. And for the first time in her career, Paula wished she could disappear into the floor. Tessa sat quietly in her cramped seat, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She stared out the window, watching clouds drift lazily past, but her mind wasn't calm. Her phone buzzed again in her lap, and she glanced down to see a short new message from her father. Stay where you are. Let them come to you. She tucked the phone away quickly, not wanting anyone around her to see it. She noticed the sudden change in energy before she even looked up. A hush seemed to spread through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, craning their necks to look down the aisle. Tessa turned her head slightly and saw Paula walking toward her, her step stiff, her smile tight and wrong. Paula stopped at her row, her face flushed pink as she crouched down slightly to be at eye level. Miss Brennan, she said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. There's been a misunderstanding regarding your seating. We'd like to invite you to return to your original seat in first class. Tessa blinked slowly, keeping her face calm. She could feel every pair of eyes on her now. Whispers had already started. Paula shifted awkwardly, forcing a thin smile. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. Tessa didn't move right away. She let the silence stretch, just long enough to make Paula squirm. Then, she looked at her coolly. Are you saying I was in the right seat the whole time? Paula's cheeks darkened. She nodded stiffly. Yes, ma'am. And you moved me because... Tessa let the question hang in the air. Paula opened her mouth, but no words came out. She struggled for a response that wouldn't dig her hole even deeper, but nothing she could say would change the truth everyone had seen. Tessa finally stood up, her back straight, her head held high. She picked up her backpack slowly, giving Paula enough time to feel the full weight of the moment. Passengers nearby didn't pretend to be polite anymore. Some openly stared. A few looked down, embarrassed for having watched silently before. Without another word, Tessa stepped into the aisle. Paula gestured for her to follow, her movements stiff and nervous. As they walked back toward first class, the entire plane seemed to watch. Tessa kept her gaze forward, feeling stronger with every step, not because she wanted revenge, but because she knew now that they all saw it. They all knew what had happened. And this time, no one could pretend they didn't. Tessa reached the first-class cabin, feeling the thick tension in the air. Every passenger in the polished leather seats turned to look at her. Some faces showed surprise, others guilt. A few simply stared blankly, unsure of what to do. Victoria, the woman who had taken her seat earlier, sat frozen, her eyes wide behind her oversized sunglasses. Paula motioned toward the empty seat, the one by the window that should have been Tessa's from the beginning. Tessa paused, her hand resting on the back of the seat for a moment. She turned slightly, her voice steady but clear enough for the nearest rouse to hear. "I had my ticket. I showed it when I boarded," she said, her tone calm, almost casual. "But I guess some people thought I didn't belong here." The words were simple, but they cut through the cabin like a knife. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man in a navy suit coughed quietly and looked away. Paula opened her mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again, realizing anything she said would only make it worse. Tessa slid into her seat without another glance at Paula or Victoria. She tucked her backpack neatly under the seat in front of her and pulled out her book again, flipping it open as if nothing had happened. But the atmosphere had shifted completely. Paula stood awkwardly beside her for a few seconds, then leaned down stiffly. "If you need anything at all, please let me know," she muttered. Tessa didn't look up. She simply turned a page in her book, the soft rustle of paper sounding louder than any words she could have spoken. Paula straightened, her face burning with shame, and hurried back toward the galley. The rest of first class seemed frozen for a moment. Then slowly, conversations resumed, but they were quieter now, filled with glances and whispers. The passengers might have gone back to their drinks and magazines, but the memory of what they had seen wouldn't leave them so easily. And for Paula, the weight of that moment was just beginning to crush down on her. Paula stumbled back into the galley, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. She could feel the sweat gathering at the back of her neck despite the cool air of the cabin. Brooke stood nearby, pretending to arrange snacks on a tray, but her eyes flicked up now and then, watching. "You okay?" Brooke asked, her voice low. Paula shot her a look, sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm fine," she snapped. But she wasn't fine, not even close. Her mind raced, replaying every decision she had made since the boarding process. She knew now, without a doubt, that she had crossed a line she couldn't step back from. Brooke hesitated before speaking again. "You know she's not just any passenger, right?" Paula gave a stiff nod, keeping her voice low. "I figured it out." Brooke pressed her lips together, glancing toward the curtain separating them from first class. "You might want to figure out what you're going to say when we land. This isn't just about moving someone, not this time." Paula didn't answer. She couldn't. She was too busy trying not to panic. Every mistake she had made now felt bigger, heavier, impossible to fix. She thought about the first time she had trained for this job. All the rules drilled into her about treating every passenger with respect. She had broken those rules without even blinking. She hadn't even hesitated when she saw Tessa sitting there, dressed simply, young, alone. And now the consequences were coming faster than she could run from them. Meanwhile, back in first class, Tessa sat calmly in her seat, flipping through the pages of her book. She wasn't reading. She was listening. Listening to the subtle changes around her, the uneasy shuffling of passengers, the clipped tone of Paula's voice from behind the curtain, the way some of the first-class guests avoided looking in her direction. She felt no need to make a scene. Her silence said everything louder than words could, and she knew her father would not let this situation end quietly. Victoria, sitting in the next row, fidgeted with her handbag, glancing over at Tessa and quickly looking away. The woman who had so easily taken Tessa's seat now looked as if she wanted to sink into the floor. Tessa leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet hum of the engines fill her ears. She knew something was building, something bigger than just a simple apology, and she was ready for it. The flight continued, but the energy in the cabin had shifted into something strange and heavy. Tessa kept her head turned toward the window, pretending to admire the view of clouds stretching endlessly across the sky. But her mind stayed sharp. She could still feel the glances sneaking her way from across the aisle, from behind the seats, even from the passengers who had earlier ignored her completely. They were watching now, pretending to be busy with their books or screens, but the guilt in the air was almost thick enough to touch. Up in the galley, Paula paced in short, tight steps, her nerves fraying more with each passing minute. Brooke busied herself with arranging snack trays, but it was clear she was trying to stay out of the way. The last thing she wanted was to get caught in the fallout. Paula pressed her hand to her forehead, trying to think. Maybe if she offered a drink, maybe if she gave an extra blanket, maybe if she apologized again, more sincerely this time, maybe that would smooth things over. But a deep part of her knew none of it would matter, not with who Tessa's father was, not with how public the humiliation had been. As Paula wrung her hands, the intercom above her crackled. "Flight attendants, please prepare for a mid-flight review." The announcement was vague, but the tone was not. It wasn't part of any normal flight procedure. Paula's stomach twisted painfully. She knew this wasn't about service or safety. It was about her. Captain Reynolds had made another call, and Jacob Brennan had made sure that whatever was going to happen next would not be quiet or private. Paula took a shaky breath and straightened her jacket, plastering a brittle smile on her face. She walked back into first class, pushing the cart ahead of her with stiff arms. "Can I get you anything, miss?" she asked as she stopped beside Tessa's seat, her voice painfully bright. Tessa slowly turned her head toward her, her eyes calm but piercing. The entire cabin seemed to still, every ear tuned in. "I'm fine," Tessa said softly, flipping another page in her book. Paula's smile faltered, but she nodded and moved away, her hands tight around the cart's handle. As she continued down the aisle, a man in a gray suit leaned slightly across the aisle toward Tessa. His voice was low, hesitant. "Miss, I just wanted to say, I saw what happened earlier. It wasn't right." Tessa looked at him for a moment, studying his face. She gave a polite nod but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Another woman, an older lady seated 2 rows ahead, turned around slightly. "If I had known," she began awkwardly, "I would have said something." Tessa simply smiled a little and returned to her book. The passengers could keep their apologies. They had made their choice when they stayed silent. Now they could sit with that discomfort. Meanwhile, Paula retreated to the front of the plane, heart hammering. She thought maybe things would calm down if she just stayed quiet until they landed. Maybe it would all blow over. She was wrong. Because just as she reached the front galley, Captain Reynolds' voice filled the cabin again, smoother this time, but unmistakably firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for any earlier inconvenience regarding seating arrangements. We are pleased to inform you that the situation has been corrected. Thank you for your patience." It sounded harmless. To most passengers, it probably was. But to Paula, it felt like a warning shot, a clear signal that the airline wasn't letting this slide into silence. She leaned heavily against the counter, feeling her legs tremble. And in her gut, she knew something bigger was waiting for her once those wheels touched the ground. Something she couldn't talk her way out of. Tessa shifted in her seat, the soft leather creaking under her as she glanced down at her phone resting on her lap. Another message had just arrived from her father. She tapped the screen lightly. "Security and executive staff will be at the gate. Stay calm. You'll be escorted personally." She tucked the phone away without reacting. No one needed to know that while they were sitting there pretending nothing had happened, a storm was already waiting for them on the ground. Victoria, who was now sitting stiffly in the seat across the aisle, peeked over her sunglasses at Tessa, her lips pressed into a tight line. She shifted uncomfortably when Tessa met her gaze for a split second. Victoria quickly looked away, fumbling with the expensive bracelet around her wrist. The luxury, the comfort, the small invisible power that people like Victoria thought they carried. It was slipping through their fingers now, replaced by awkward silence and fake smiles. Brooke pushed the cart slowly down the aisle, pretending to check drink orders. She was doing her best to make herself invisible, but her eyes betrayed her nervousness. She glanced at Tessa once, then quickly looked forward again. She didn't want to be part of this mess any more than she already was. Paula remained in the galley, her back pressed against the wall, her breathing shallow. She had picked up a stack of cups just to have something to do with her hands, but she couldn't stop the slight trembling in her fingers. Every time she thought about what was waiting when they landed, her stomach twisted into tighter knots. Meetings with executives were never casual. They weren't friendly sit-downs. They were investigations. And in this case, with Jacob Brennan's daughter involved, there would be no second chances. The loudspeaker crackled again, and Captain Reynolds' voice came back, smoother, but carrying a quiet authority that made every passenger listen up. Cabin crew, prepare for initial descent. The announcement was standard, but the moment he said it, a new kind of tension spread through the cabin. Everyone knew that landing meant more than just getting off the plane this time. For some, it meant moving on with their day. For others, it meant a reckoning. Tessa adjusted her seatbelt slowly, feeling the plane tilt downward as it began its slow descent. She gazed out the window at the patchwork of cities and fields growing larger below. Her heart thudded steadily in her chest, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was a quiet certainty. She hadn't needed to shout or cause a scene to expose what had happened. All she had needed was patience, and now the consequences were coming naturally, in their own time. Across the aisle, Victoria was fidgeting more noticeably now, pulling at the hem of her sleeve and glancing nervously at the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin. Tessa didn't look at her again. She didn't need to. Victoria's discomfort was its own kind of apology. The plane shuddered gently as it moved lower through the clouds, the landing gear thumping into place beneath them. Tessa folded her hands neatly in her lap, her face calm, her breathing steady. In the galley, Paula stood frozen, staring at the closed door, her thoughts racing. Maybe she could apologize again. Maybe she could explain. But deep down, she knew none of it would matter now. She had made a choice when she looked at Tessa and decided she didn't belong. She had backed that choice with action. And no words could erase the fact that the wrong person had been watching every single second of it. The cabin lights flickered softly as the plane lowered closer and closer to the runway. The wheels screeched lightly as they touched down, the plane bouncing once before settling into a smooth roll down the tarmac. Tessa kept her hands folded, her eyes steady, as the plane taxied toward the gate. Her phone buzzed one more time. She glanced down without picking it up. Security is waiting. Stay seated. They will come to you first. The engines whined as the plane slowed to a stop. The seatbelt light dinged off. Around her, passengers began gathering their belongings, pretending everything was normal. But it wasn't normal. Not anymore. And the ones who had watched silently, who had said nothing when she was humiliated, would now have front-row seats to what true accountability looked like. The familiar chime of the seatbelt sign switching off filled the cabin, but no one moved right away. The usual scramble for overhead bins and rushed goodbyes was replaced with an odd stillness, as if everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one wanted to be the first to stir it. Tessa stayed seated, calm and unmoving, her backpack still tucked neatly under the seat in front of her. She smoothed the front of her hoodie with slow, steady hands, feeling the weight of so many glances pressing down on her, but refusing to acknowledge any of them. A soft buzz came from the cabin doors, and moments later, the door swung open. Instead of the usual jet bridge worker, 2 uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane. They were calm but serious, their gazes sweeping across the cabin like a silent announcement. Behind them stood a man in a dark navy suit with a clipboard in his hand. His ID badge flashed under the overhead lights. A senior operations manager for the airline. Passengers stiffened. Some craned their necks to see better. Others dropped their eyes to their laps, pretending not to notice the sudden presence of authority walking down the aisle. The operations manager spoke in a clear voice, polite but firm. "Tessa Brennan?" he asked, though he already knew. His eyes found her immediately, sitting with a quiet dignity that filled the space around her. Tessa raised her hand slightly, signaling without a word. The manager gave a small nod. "Miss Brennan, if you'll remain seated for a moment, we'll be escorting you off first." The tension in the cabin snapped tighter. Passengers whispered behind their hands, stealing glances between Tessa, the officers, and the bewildered flight attendant standing frozen at the front. Victoria had gone pale, shrinking into her seat like she hoped she could disappear into the upholstery. The manager turned slightly, scanning the crew. His voice, though still calm, had an unmistakable edge now. "Lead flight attendant Paula Hayes, please come with us as well." Paula froze in place. Her hands gripped the beverage cart so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain, but no words came. Her legs felt like they were moving on their own as she stepped shakily into the aisle. The manager didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Authority dripped from every word he spoke. "Per orders from Mr. Brennan's office, you will be meeting with airline officials immediately regarding today's incident." Passengers leaned into the aisle, openly gawking now. A few tried to pretend they weren't listening, but the interest on their faces was obvious. Some faces even showed a flicker of satisfaction, watching a person who had once carried herself with such sharp authority now stumbling in shame. Tessa stood, when the officer gently motioned for her to do so. She adjusted her backpack onto one shoulder, her head held high, her steps slow but steady. As she moved up the aisle, she caught small glimpses of the passengers' reactions. The man who had tried to offer her a nervous apology earlier couldn't meet her eyes now. The older woman who had said she would have spoken up stared fixedly at the floor. Victoria, still sunk low in her seat, muttered something under her breath, but Tessa didn't slow down or respond. Whatever Victoria had to say now didn't matter. Paula followed a few paces behind, her face burning, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She kept her gaze locked on the carpet, feeling more exposed than she ever had in her life. When they reached the door of the plane, the security officers stepped aside, allowing Tessa to exit first. The operations manager gestured respectfully, as if acknowledging her status without needing to say it. She walked onto the jet bridge, the soft click of her sneakers against the floor, the only sound she focused on. Behind her, Paula stepped out into the bright terminal lights, blinking rapidly as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a cold wave. Waiting at the end of the jet bridge were more suited executives, stern-faced and silent. Paula knew then that this wasn't just about an apology or a meeting. This was about survival, and her career was hanging by a thread. Tessa paused just inside the terminal, turning slightly to look back at the plane she had just left. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. Her face was steady, unreadable. But her presence alone spoke louder than any words could have. She had been forced out of her seat because someone decided she didn't fit their picture of who belonged in first class. But now, everyone knew exactly who she was, and this time, no one could erase it. Tessa stood calmly as the airport staff and security made space for her to walk through the terminal. People at nearby gates paused their conversations, some lowering their coffee cups mid-sip, others craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what was happening. It wasn't every day they saw a scene like this. Tessa moved quietly, without rushing, her steps slow and confident. She didn't need to say anything. The presence of the suited executives trailing behind her was enough to make everyone realize she was someone important, someone not to be overlooked again. Paula followed several steps behind, her head down, her heart hammering so loudly in her ears that she could barely hear the shuffle of footsteps around her. She caught glimpses of the onlookers, wide eyes, whispered words, phones being pulled out discreetly to capture the moment. Her cheeks burned hotter with every step. At the end of the walkway, a tall man in a black tailored suit waited with his arms crossed. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. This was Adrian Burke, Director of Customer Experience for the airline. Everyone in the company knew his reputation: strict, professional, and utterly unforgiving when it came to customer mistreatment. He didn't smile when Paula approached. He didn't even greet her. Instead, he turned to Tessa, giving her a respectful nod. "Miss Brennan, welcome," he said, his voice steady and clear. "We've arranged a private transport for you to continue your journey comfortably. Your luggage has already been secured." Tessa nodded politely, her face remaining calm, not giving away any emotion. Adrian then shifted his attention to Paula, his expression cooling even further. "Ms. Hayes, you'll come with us." Paula opened her mouth, desperate to explain, to plead her side of the story, but Adrian held up a hand, silencing her immediately. "There will be a full investigation. You'll have your chance to speak, but not here." Security officers flanked her, not touching but making it very clear she was expected to follow. Passengers and staff at the terminal openly stared now, some whispering, some shaking their heads. The humiliation Paula had once dished out so easily now wrapped around her like chains she couldn't shake off. Tessa moved toward a sleek black car parked just outside the glass doors. A uniformed driver opened the back door for her with a slight bow. She slid inside smoothly, the leather seats cool against her skin. As the door closed behind her, she finally allowed herself a slow breath. The car pulled away from the curb, the airport shrinking behind her. Tessa looked out the tinted window, seeing flashes of the terminal, the busy travelers, the long security lines, the ordinary world still spinning outside the walls of power and privilege that had just collapsed around Paula. Inside the airport, Paula was led down a separate hallway, away from the main terminals, toward a set of gray double doors that few employees ever wanted to see up close. Beyond those doors sat a small conference room where executive reviews were held. Most who entered those rooms walked out without a badge. As she walked, Paula's mind raced. She thought about the day she had been hired, the pride she had felt, the long hours she had worked. She thought about how easy it had become to make quick judgments about passengers, how normal it had seemed to assume who belonged and who didn't. She had told herself it was about order, about professionalism. But now, stripped of her control, she saw it for what it really was: bias, unchecked and ugly. Ahead of her, the doors swung open and she was ushered inside. Adrian entered behind her, placing a thick folder on the table before sitting down across from her. He opened the file slowly, methodically, flipping through the papers inside, printed complaints, witness statements, even screenshots from security cameras inside the cabin. Each piece of evidence piled heavier onto Paula's shoulders, crushing whatever hope she had left. Adrian looked up, his voice still professional but cold. "Ms. Hayes, you are here to respond to serious concerns regarding misconduct and violation of customer service protocols. Do you have anything you wish to say before we begin?" Paula swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to say it wasn't what it looked like. But sitting across from Adrian, knowing what she had done, she realized there was nothing she could say that would make it better. Tessa, meanwhile, leaned back in the soft seat of the car as it sped smoothly toward a private lounge where her father was waiting. She glanced down at her phone. A message from her father blinked on the screen. "Proud of you for staying calm. See you soon." Tessa smiled slightly, not out of triumph, but out of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't fought. She had let the truth carry its own weight. And sometimes truth was heavier than anything else. Inside the sterile conference room, the clock ticked loudly, each second stretching the tension thicker in the air. Paula sat stiffly in the hard chair across from Adrian Burke, feeling like a schoolchild about to be scolded, except this was worse. This wasn't a scolding. This was her career slipping through her fingers. Adrian flipped to another page in the folder, his eyes skimming quickly over the documents before speaking. "We have testimonies from 4 passengers in first class who witnessed the removal of Miss Brennan from her assigned seat. All of them confirmed that you questioned her without cause and prioritized another passenger without checking the manifest properly." Paula's mouth was dry. She clutched her hands tightly in her lap, wishing for something, anything, that could undo the last few hours. I didn't mean any harm," she croaked, her voice thin. Adrian's face didn't change. "Intentions don't erase actions, Ms. Hayes, especially when those actions involve discrimination against a paying customer. In this case," he paused, tapping the file lightly, "the daughter of the airline's owner." Paula lowered her eyes, shame burning hotter than anything she had ever felt. Adrian continued, his tone even. "In addition to passenger complaints, your fellow crew member, Brooke Davis, submitted an internal report. He pulled out a separate sheet of paper. She observed your handling of Miss Brennan and noted concern over your behavior. Paula's head snapped up, betrayal slicing through her like a knife. Brooke? The same Brooke who had kept her head down the entire flight? She had reported her? As if reading her thoughts, Adrian added, Miss Davis noted that while she did not intervene at the time, and that will be addressed separately, she did feel it necessary to document what she witnessed after learning who the passenger was. He closed the file slowly, the click of the folder snapping shut making Paula flinch slightly. Adrian folded his hands on the table. Ms. Hayes, based on the evidence, the airline is placing you on immediate suspension without pay, pending final termination review. Paula opened her mouth to plead, but he continued firmly. You will not return to active duty until this matter is closed. We expect full cooperation with the investigation. Any refusal will result in permanent termination, without eligibility for rehire across all branches. The weight of those words crushed her. She wanted to protest, to explain that it had all been a misunderstanding, but deep inside, she knew that wasn't true. She hadn't questioned the other first-class passengers. She hadn't asked the man in the expensive suit to show his ticket. She hadn't challenged the woman in pearls. She had looked at Tessa, young, dressed simply, and made a decision based purely on appearance. Now, she was paying the price. Meanwhile, Tessa's car pulled into a private entrance reserved for executives and VIPs. A second black car was already waiting there. Standing beside it was her father, Jacob Brennan. Tall, with a presence that could fill a room, he watched as his daughter stepped out of the vehicle. Tessa walked toward him, her posture straight, her face calm. Jacob met her halfway and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Are you all right? He asked, his voice low but filled with concern. I'm fine, Tessa said simply. And she was. She hadn't allowed the experience to break her. Instead, it had strengthened something inside her, a quiet fire that wouldn't be easily put out. Jacob studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. You handled yourself better than many adults would have. He motioned for her to join him inside the private lounge. As they walked through the sleek, polished halls, Jacob spoke in a measured tone. The board has already been notified. Changes will be made. Training programs will be updated. Oversight policies will be tightened. Tessa listened but said nothing. It wasn't about policies to her. It wasn't about corporate meetings or official apologies. It was about how easily people like Paula could decide who deserved respect and who didn't, and how important it was to show them that they didn't get to make that decision unchecked anymore. They entered a quiet, luxurious lounge where a few executives waited, all of them rising to their feet respectfully when they saw Jacob and Tessa. No one treated her like she didn't belong here. Not now. Jacob led her to a seat and turned to address the small group. Before we discuss next steps, he said firmly, I want everyone here to understand something. He placed a hand lightly on Tessa's shoulder. This is not just about one mistake. It's about what kind of company we choose to be moving forward. Tessa looked up at him, pride flickering in her chest. For the first time since that humiliating moment on the plane, she allowed herself a real smile. The people who had tried to make her feel small would now have to face a reality where she, and others like her, could no longer be pushed aside so easily. Justice wasn't just being served today. It was being built for tomorrow. In the lounge, the air was heavy with seriousness as Jacob Brennan continued addressing the small group of top airline executives. Every word he spoke landed with weight. No one interrupted him. No one even shifted in their seats. They all knew what was at stake. We will not tolerate discrimination in any form, in any cabin, at any level, Jacob said, his voice steady but cutting. This incident didn't just embarrass my daughter. It exposed a crack in the foundation of how we treat our customers. He glanced around the room, meeting every executive's eye before continuing. From today forward, there will be mandatory training for all flight and ground staff. Real training, not just signatures on a paper. There will be secret passengers assigned to review service behavior, Immediate consequences for staff found treating passengers differently based on appearance, age, background, anything. Tessa watched quietly, feeling a growing sense of pride. Her father wasn't the kind of man who issued hollow promises. When he said things would change, he meant it. Jacob took a breath, softening his tone slightly as he looked at Tessa. This is bigger than an apology. It's about building a culture that doesn't just correct mistakes when they're caught, but prevents them from happening at all. The executives nodded quickly, murmuring agreement, but it wasn't enough. Jacob pointed to one of the men sitting at the end of the table. "Daniel, you'll draft a formal apology. Not just to Tessa, but to all passengers who've ever been treated unfairly. I want it published publicly. No hiding, no spin." Daniel nodded, already scribbling notes. Jacob then turned to another woman seated beside him. "Lauren, begin internal audits immediately. I want random checks on flights starting next week. Use outside agencies if you have to. I want this done cleanly." Lauren gave a quick, serious nod. Jacob leaned back slightly, letting the weight of his words settle. "Make no mistake," he said, voice firm again. "This is personal. If we cannot protect the dignity of every single passenger, regardless of who they are, then we don't deserve to lead this industry." The room stayed silent for a long beat. Finally, Jacob rose from his chair, motioning for Tessa to join him. She stood smoothly, feeling the eyes of every executive following her. But this time, those stares weren't filled with doubt. They were filled with a kind of respect, a recognition that she had changed something real. As they left the lounge together, Jacob placed a firm hand on her back. "You didn't have to yell," he said quietly. "You didn't have to scream. You stood your ground and let the truth speak for itself. That's strength, Tessa." She smiled up at him, feeling lighter than she had since the moment Paula had stood over her seat with that tight, false smile. "I wasn't going to let her decide my worth," Tessa said simply. Jacob chuckled softly. "That's my girl." They stepped through the private corridors of the airport, passing staff members who quickly moved aside, nodding respectfully. The airport was buzzing with its usual noise. Boarding calls, rolling suitcases, low conversations. But for Tessa, everything sounded distant. She had faced a quiet kind of war and won it with silence, dignity, and patience. Meanwhile, far from the comfort of the executive lounge, Paula sat alone in the same small conference room, waiting for a decision she already knew was coming. The formal review had ended. She had been allowed to speak, to explain, but deep down she knew her words hadn't mattered. Action spoke louder, and her actions had sealed her fate. She clutched the handle of her carry-on bag, the one she had brought thinking it would be just another routine flight. Now it was all she had left as she waited for security to escort her out. No uniform, no badge, no second chances. For years she had believed her authority gave her the right to make snap decisions, to judge who belonged where. But in the end, all it had taken was one quiet, steady teenage girl to tear that illusion down. A soft knock came at the door. A security officer stepped in, his expression professional but distant. "Ms. Hayes, we're ready for you." Paula stood up slowly, the wheels of her bag rattling loudly against the floor as she followed him through the side halls of the airport. A different path from the one Tessa had taken, a path no one envied. She didn't look up. She didn't meet anyone's eyes. She just walked forward, the weight of her decisions heavier than any luggage she could carry. And this time, no apology, no excuse, could lighten it. Outside in the warm afternoon sun, Tessa and Jacob moved toward a waiting black SUV parked near the private terminal entrance. The driver opened the door with a slight nod, and Tessa climbed into the back seat, her father following behind her. The doors closed with a solid, comforting thud, shutting out the noise of the airport. As the car pulled away smoothly, Tessa let herself relax against the seat. She turned her head to look out the window, watching the planes lined up on the runway, their noses pointed toward destinations she might visit another day, on her own terms. No one would ever force her out of her seat again. Jacob sat silently beside her for a few moments, giving her space. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "You know," he said, "sometimes real power isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about holding steady when everyone else expects you to break." Tessa smiled faintly without taking her eyes off the window. She understood that better now than she ever had before. Back inside the airport, the story was spreading quickly. It wasn't just the staff who knew. Passengers were talking too. Videos had started popping up online, short clips showing Tessa being escorted back to her rightful seat, Paula's pale, shocked face trailing behind her. People were posting angry comments praising Tessa's calm dignity, questioning how often things like this happened quietly when no one important was watching. The airline's public relations team scrambled behind the scenes, preparing statements and monitoring social media feeds as the story gained momentum. It was no longer a private embarrassment. It had become a public lesson, and it wasn't just Paula's name attached to it. It was the airline's too. In a small room tucked behind one of the terminals, Paula sat alone, staring at her phone. She had seen the news alerts. She had seen the comments. Strangers were calling her out by name, describing her as arrogant, biased, heartless. She turned the phone over, face down on the table, unable to look at it any longer. None of the excuses she had prepared in her mind would fix what she had done. None of them sounded convincing even to herself. She had spent years priding herself on her professionalism, her sharp instincts, her ability to read passengers. But sitting here now, stripped of her uniform, stripped of her authority, she realized she had read everything wrong. Tessa had been polite, prepared, belonging exactly where she was, and Paula had been the one out of place all along. A security guard appeared at the door, clearing his throat. "It's time." Paula nodded numbly, standing and picking up her small bag. She walked through the terminal with the guard beside her, trying to keep her chin up, but every step felt like a public confession. People were watching. She could feel it. Some recognized her from the videos already circulating online. Others just sensed that something had gone terribly wrong. No one smiled at her. No one offered sympathy. She was invisible now, not in the way she had once made passengers feel, but in the way someone becomes when their importance has been stripped away. Out on the curb, a plain, unmarked car waited for her. No fancy black SUV, no VIP treatment, just a silent ride home to an uncertain future. She climbed in without a word, pulling the doors shut behind her. The car pulled away, leaving the bustling airport behind. Paula leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. But the shame, the regret, the crushing finality of her actions stayed with her. Back in the SUV, Jacob glanced at his daughter, studying her profile in the afternoon light. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again, softer this time. Tessa nodded, her voice even. "Yeah, I'm sure." She was more than okay. She had faced disrespect with calm strength. She had held her ground without screaming or lowering herself. And she had reminded everyone, even those who thought they were untouchable, that respect wasn't something you earned with money or status. It was something every human being deserved from the start. And from now on, anyone flying Brennan Airlines would remember that. The SUV continued down the highway, moving farther away from the airport and closer to the city skyline. Tessa leaned her head against the window, feeling the hum of the road beneath her. Her phone vibrated again, and this time it was a flood of notifications. Friends, classmates, even people she barely knew were messaging her. Screenshots of news articles, short video clips from the plane, posts praising her calmness under pressure. Some messages were short and supportive. "Proud of you. You handled that like a boss." Others were longer, people sharing their own experiences of being overlooked, mistreated, judged unfairly. Tessa scrolled through a few, her heart tightening. She realized now that this wasn't just her story anymore. It was bigger than that. She locked her phone and set it aside, closing her eyes for a moment. Her father let the silence stretch comfortably between them, giving her space to process everything. He knew better than anyone how heavy sudden attention could feel, even if it came with praise. Meanwhile, back at the airport, the public announcement from Brennan Airlines had just gone live. A carefully written letter was posted on all official social media channels, on the website, even printed and pinned to bulletin boards inside the terminals. At Brennan Airlines, we believe in dignity, fairness, and respect for all passengers. Recent events on one of our flights fell far below those standards. We apologize directly to Miss Tessa Brennan and to anyone who has ever felt unseen or unvalued while traveling. We are implementing immediate changes, including mandatory employee retraining, independent flight audits, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Our commitment is simple. Everyone belongs. The letter spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story. Journalists reached out, wanting interviews. Discussions bloomed online, some angry, some hopeful. Some people, seeing the airline's public reaction, praised them for addressing the issue quickly. Others pointed out that it shouldn't have taken the owner's daughter being mistreated for real change to start. Tessa didn't disagree with them. It shouldn't have taken this. But if her experience could force open a conversation, if it could create space for others to be heard, then it mattered. Far from the whirlwind of public reaction, Paula sat alone in her small apartment, the city lights outside her window blurring into a hazy mess. Her dismissal from the airline had been finalized. Her employee ID deactivated. Her email account shut down. She had spent the last few hours reading through some of the comments online, her chest twisting tighter with every word. She hadn't expected sympathy, but the sheer weight of public judgment stunned her. And it wasn't just about her actions on the plane. People were digging into other complaints that had been quietly filed over the years. Other moments where her quick judgment, her sharp tone, her impatience had left scars. She had thought she was good at her job. She had thought she was respected. But now she saw how small, unchecked moments had built a reputation she didn't even realize she had. Paula picked up her phone and scrolled to the draft of an email she had started earlier. A personal apology addressed directly to Tessa. She hadn't sent it yet. Part of her wondered if it even mattered anymore. But another part of her, the part that still wanted to believe she wasn't beyond fixing, knew it wasn't about whether Tessa would read it. It was about taking responsibility. She began typing again, her hands shaking slightly. Miss Brennan, I don't expect forgiveness, and I know an apology may not erase what I did, but I want you to know that I see it now. I saw only what I wanted to see that day, and I failed you. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I am sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I was wrong. She stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send. The message floated into the digital void. Whether it would be seen or ignored, she didn't know. But for the first time in days, Paula felt a small shift inside her, a tiny crack in the heavy wall of pride she had built around herself. In the SUV, Tessa's phone buzzed again, a new email notification flashing across the screen. She hesitated, then picked it up, skimming the first few lines of Paula's message. She read it twice, her face unreadable. Then she tucked the phone away without replying, choosing not to let the weight of Paula's regret settle on her shoulders. Her story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making people beg for forgiveness. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice and letting others learn their own lessons, however long it took. The city lights grew brighter as the SUV moved closer to home. Tessa felt a quiet peace growing in her chest. This wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something better, for her, and maybe even for people she would never meet but who deserved better every time they stepped onto a plane, into a room, into any space where they had every right to belong. The SUV slowed as it turned into the long private driveway leading up to the Brennan family estate. Towering trees lined the road, their leaves rustling gently in the evening breeze. The last streaks of sunlight stretched low across the sky, casting the world in a soft golden glow. It was the kind of peace that only came at the end of a long, hard day, a peace that felt earned. Tessa stared out at the familiar path ahead, feeling an unfamiliar mix of emotions tightening in her chest. Relief, exhaustion, a strange kind of pride, and something even deeper. A sense that she had stepped into a new version of herself without even realizing it. The SUV rolled to a smooth stop at the front entrance. The driver quickly stepped out, opening the door for Tessa. She climbed out slowly, stretching her arms, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Jacob stepped out behind her, walking quietly by her side as they made their way up the marble steps to the house. Inside, the house was warm and bright. Staff members offered respectful nods as they passed, but no one interrupted. Tessa headed straight for the den, her favorite room, full of oversized couches, soft lighting and shelves packed with books and family photos. She dropped her backpack onto the floor and sank into a wide chair, curling her legs up underneath her. Jacob followed, setting a thick file down on the coffee table before taking the seat across from her. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The house hummed gently around them, the quiet clink of dishes from the kitchen, the soft hum of distant conversation. Finally, Jacob leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was softer now, without the commanding edge he used at board meetings. "You know," he said, watching her carefully, "what you did today wasn't just important for yourself." Tessa looked up, her eyes steady. "You showed every young person who's been pushed aside that they're not invisible." Jacob said, "You showed the people who were watching silently that silence isn't neutral. And you showed this company, my company, that there's no place for arrogance or bias here. Not anymore." Tessa felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wasn't going to cry, not tonight. Jacob smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened the lines on his face. "You taught them more today than any meeting or memo ever could." Tessa sat back, letting his words sink in. It hadn't felt brave at the time, it had just felt necessary. But maybe that was what real strength looked like. Doing what was right, even when no one handed you a microphone, even when the easy choice was to shrink away. She glanced at the thick file Jacob had set down, the new policies he was putting in place because of what had happened. A legacy bigger than any one flight, bigger than one moment. The world outside continued on, busy and loud and complicated. But in this house, tonight, something had shifted permanently. Later, when she was alone in her room, Tessa scrolled through her phone again. Messages of support flooded her inbox, classmates she hadn't talked to in months, teachers, even strangers. But she paused when she saw Paula's email again. She reread it carefully this time. The words were clumsy, but honest. Tessa didn't respond. She didn't need to. Sometimes real growth happened not through answers, but through reflection. Paula would have to walk her own road now, without hand-holding, without forgiveness handed easily to make her feel better. Tessa placed her phone face down on the nightstand and looked out the window at the stars blinking into existence across the deep blue sky. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even bitter. She felt something quieter and stronger settling in her chest, a determination that no matter where she went in life, no matter who tried to underestimate her, she would carry this moment with her. The moment she proved, not just to others but to herself, that she deserved every room she walked into, every seat she sat in, every opportunity she reached for. The world might not always welcome her with open arms. It might still question her right to be there, but she would never question it herself again. And that kind of certainty, she realized, was more powerful than anything anyone could ever try to take away. As she closed her eyes and drifted into sleep, Tessa knew this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. If you liked this story, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories.